Hello and welcome to another episode of Tea Time Trauma Talk with Brad. That's me. I'm Brad, and the tea today is a spring 2006 harvest pu'er from northwest China. I'll leave some information down below if you're interested in checking that type of tea out. This particular one has been probably sold out for 3 years. It's when I first bought it, and I've been using the same batch ever since. So what I'd like to talk about today is the idea that we are in the midst of a collective trauma. I've heard that on social media, and I've heard it in my professional and personal life as well. Well, I like to argue that we're more so in a collective adversity. In trauma, when we say that we're in the midst of a trauma, that depletes us of our power. It strips us of our power. It strips us of our mobility and opportunity to move against the threat. When we consider that we are in the midst of a collective adversity, we can mobilize. There's power, there's organization, there's things that we can do in order to minimize the opportunity or the risks of traumatic stress happening. There's no doubt that what we're going through is difficult. There's absolutely no doubt. It's sad, it's confusing, there's grief, there's loss, there's change, there's risk. However, these things can be approached with reason and with agency and efficacy and power, and we can do that collectively. But we need to start on an individual basis in order for us individuals to be strong for other individuals, and then we start to see that we as a collective are feeling much stronger and much more able to manage what's happening, because we're not necessarily getting the guidance from the powers that be up there in Washington. So we're having to really take this on our own, and that's part of the issue, is that uncertainty, that lack of direction and clarity that makes things very difficult. One second. I learned that with using this microphone that you can hear me swallowing, and it's not entirely pleasant. So let's take a look at some of the things that we've been experiencing, either individually or collectively. We've been experiencing lack of clarity in our thought, forgetfulness, some aggravation, anger. Unfortunately, violence is on the rise. We're experiencing anxiety and depression, and the numbing out. And numbing out comes out in a lot of different ways, through substance use, through other addictive behaviors, and through our natural processes that allow us to numb out and to numb pain. So all of these things that we're experiencing individually and collectively, socially, are explainable from a purely biological perspective, and that will hopefully allow us to gain some clarity about what we can do to reduce these experiences. I don't like to use the word symptoms, because I don't think they're symptoms. They're just indicators of what needs to be healed. So let's look at the stress response in general through the polyvagal lens. And I've used this example before, and I'm going to continue because it's completely valid, and it makes a lot of sense. So we have 3 stages of stress response. When we sense threat, the first thing for us to do is to use our ventral vagal, which is our social engagement nervous system that connects the heart and the face, as we've talked about before. So that's what we're using when we're hanging with family or friends or having a good time. We're feeling socially engaged, but that's also our first stage threat response. We use that to engage with the threat, to try to use our voice to manage the threat. And we did that when COVID-19 started, when we first learned about it a few months ago. We tried to use our ventral vagal. We tried to understand it. We tried to talk and gain clarity with it. We weren't getting that clarity, and that was extremely frustrating because we were really trying hard. And with that lack of understanding, it felt as though, well, you know what, this ventral vagal stuff isn't working. It's just not working. So that's the first stage. The second stage is slipping into the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the ventral vagal has a brake on the sympathetic nervous system, but when the ventral vagal doesn't work, it lets that brake go. And we know the key components of the sympathetic nervous system are fight and flight. So it's mobility. It's mobility against the threat. It's either going to aggress the threat or it's going to run away from the threat. And we saw that come out socially through our hoarding of toilet paper and hoarding of hand sanitizer and water and all these other things. Things got pretty wild there for a little bit. We saw people acting on an individualistic basis, not collectively, but acting on an individualistic basis through their mobility, through their stress response. And you may have done it yourself. There's no judgment there. That's just biologically explainable. Wish that could have happened a different way, but that's the way it was. And it seems to have calmed down. It went on for a few weeks there, but it seems to have calmed down because what's happened now is that mobility got us from homeostasis through allostasis and back to some type of homeostasis. However, we're still surrounded by threat. So the threat is still there. We know that the threat is still there. We still know that we can't seem to manage the threat. And that threat seems to be different every day. And for some of us, we've slipped out of that mobility and into the immobility of the dorsal vagal. So that's the third stage of our stress response. When the ventral vagal and the sympathetic nervous system have failed to manage or overcome the threat, we slip into the dorsal vagal, which is in part the freeze response, which is anxiety, or it can also be the fall response, which is our depression. Either of those two, we're submitting to the threat. The freeze is to fool the threat into thinking that we're dead, and so is the fall. Both of those, our heart rates go funny, blood pressure seems to drop. We become immobile, essentially. Anxiety and depression are next door neighbors. You seem to have slightly different energy, but they're next door neighbors and also slightly different perspectives. Whereas anxiety thinks that everything is already or going to go wrong. At any given time, we can still tend to get through the day, but it's a very high-strung energy, whereas depression looks as everything that's already gone wrong. And so it's harder to move through the day. It's harder to get up out of bed. It's harder to care for the self because your energy is so low. But both of those are submission. So let's consider that everything that we're experiencing individually and collectively are purely biological responses to a threat. And there's two ways to sense threat. We know that our conscious awareness can assess threat, safety or threat in the environment. It can see things, it can hear things, it can smell things. And we know that. When we're in it, we know it. So that's our conscious awareness. And we might be consciously telling ourselves that when I stay home, I'm safe. When I do this, I'm safe. However, I'm still feeling agitated. I'm still feeling depressed. I'm still feeling something else. I'm not feeling alive in my ventral vagal. That's because we have a different opportunity to assess threat in our environment, and that is through our nervous system. That's an idea called neuroception, coined by Dr. Stephen Porges, same gentleman who developed the polyvagal theory. He says that our nervous system is just as able, if not more keenly able, to assess threat and safety in our environment than our conscious awareness. And depending on how our nervous system is nurtured in childhood or what it experiences throughout life, because it's consistently adapting to our needs throughout life, depending on how it's been developed, it's more primed to assess a certain type of threat. So if you grew up with abandonment or isolation, you will be going through life sensitive, more elevated, sensitive, yeah, that came out wrong, but you'll be more elevated towards that type of threat. If you grew up without food, you'll be more elevated towards that type of threat. You'll be more able to assess that from a nervous system perspective, and these things are all happening on a non-conscious level. So beyond your conscious awareness. So keep that in mind. Your nervous system is picking up threat or danger in your environment, and safety too, in your environment just as quickly, and it's processing those on a level that you might not be aware of unless you know your nervous system and you get to understand it. And that's where we're going next, is if we know that all these things are biological responses and that we assess threat and then have these responses as a result, well, we can do things to curb these responses and to have healthier, more beneficial, and more appropriate responses to threat. And then when we do that, we get to be healthier for ourselves and then healthier for other people. And the cool thing is that when you experience someone who's a container, someone who can help you experience your stuff and help you feel organized, then you can go about doing that for someone else. And then they feel organized. And then they go about doing it for somebody else, and then they feel organized, and so on and so forth. And the R-naught factor of that type of thing is incredibly high. We know the R-naught factor for coronavirus is high, but the R-naught for our collective well-being is far more powerful. And let's keep that in mind. Dr. Daniel Siegel calls this idea of empathy mindsight. It's not just practicing empathy, but it's doing it in such a way that when a person knows themselves, they know their inner workings, they know where they start and where they end and all the stuff that goes on in between it, and they can make sense of that world. They can experience empathy for another person's suffering and sit with that empathy, but know that this is me and that is them. That's extremely beneficial. You can make sense of that when you know who you are. If you are not clearly aware of who you are, or you're working on it, but you still want to practice empathy, there's a risk of that empathetic experience overwhelming the person who's practicing the empathy, because you don't have those clear boundaries. So you can feel overwhelmed by the experience. You can be actually feeling used or violated afterwards, confused, and not wanting to do it in the future. So when we're seeing people out there in the news or in our real lives and they're suffering, we're experiencing that inside of ourselves because that's who we are. And that feeling can be very overwhelming, and it might turn us off from doing that in the future. So in order to experience empathy for another person, we need to know ourselves more clearly in order for that to be truly beneficial and for this to really work. So what are some things that we can do to help ourselves in this time? Now, we've talked about the techniques, the self-soothing hug and the butterfly tap and all that stuff from the previous videos, and that's good. Keep doing those things because those are beneficial. They definitely do help. I'm sitting on my meditation cushion. I'm at home today, and so that's what I've been doing, is just fidgeting around, just to let you know that's what I'm doing. There are other things that, if we look at what happens after traumatic stress, what changes in our psychology and physiology after traumatic stress, we can help prevent those things from happening. We have a sense of timelessness after traumatic stress. And so if we structure our day to get up at the same time every day, and that takes time for the circadian clock in the brain to get used to waking up, say at 7 o'clock every day, but you do end up doing it. You will. It could take up to 10 days. But build the structure of getting up at the same time every day, even if you don't have to go anywhere. Get up at the same time, make breakfast at the same time, schedule lunch, schedule activities with other people, stick around with other people, schedule time for yourself that type of thing. Have some routine and follow that routine. Traumatic stress also tends to deplete our ability to relate to people. So keep in touch with your family and friends for as much as you can. Keep talking to people. Write a letter, send emails, do Skype, do Zoom, whatever it is. Just use the phone, do face-to-face. Remember to talk to the people that you live with. Traumatic stress also disconnects us from people in a way that we don't experience our empathy, we don't experience our endorphins, we don't experience safety. And we can do that through simple, self-soothing hug. If you live by yourself, the self-soothing hug is really there. If you have a pet, even cats, hold your pet, hold your goldfish, hold your dog. Don't hold your goldfish, just pretend you're holding your goldfish. Admire your goldfish. Stay connected with your people. Eat well. Eat as well as you can. Feed your body, especially if you're feeling the depression and the anxiety. The gut isn't working right. And so it needs to be fed. You want to feed it as many healthy foods as you can to get that gut moving again and to feeling better so it can produce the serotonin and the dopamine that you need. If you're not meditating, then this is a really good time to start. And you don't need to do this for an hour or 20 minutes. You can do it for simply 5 minutes. But in the context of stress, meditation helps on a few different levels. First of all, every time that we meditate, we're strengthening or activating our prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex is something that gets turned down in the moment of stress. And with this prolonged stress, our PFC might not be engaged on a consistent basis. It might not be allowed to feel safe and activated as much as we need it to. So when we close our eyes and pay attention to our body, we're simply doing flexing of the PFC. Now, the PFC is responsible for communicating with the amygdala, which is our fear center in our brain. The PFC acts as an inhibitor of the amygdala. If the PFC is healthy, it can inhibit the fear response to a reasonable degree of something that's appropriate for what's happening. If the PFC is not functioning properly, it can't do that. And then we end up having a fear response that's redlining instead of just revving to 1,000 RPM or 2,000 or whatever it might be. That's necessary to get us out of the situation. We don't have to redline all the time. The prefrontal cortex, or like, as I like to say, when it's under stress or under duress, the PFC is more like KFC. When it's more like KFC, it's also very difficult to plan ahead, to judge appropriate words. It's our CEO. It does all of the executive functioning for the brain. So if you've had difficulty with planning ahead or communicating with individuals, even people that you see every single day, people that you love, it's been very difficult. Keep in mind, that's stuff that happens up here in our prefrontal cortex, our judgment, planning, foresight, all that stuff. Another thing that gets affected and the thing that we might be feeling is forgetfulness, just that general cloudy-headedness. And that is in part, the cloudy-headedness is in part the PFC not functioning properly, but the forgetfulness is the cortisol's effect on our hippocampus. And the hippocampus, when that's not functioning properly, it can't integrate information and senses into memory, into explicit memory where we can recall it when we want to. It gets fragmented. And that's a very, very consistent issue for people who experience stress on a daily basis, is their memories tend to be poor. We also have a tendency, or potential, I should say, for dissociation, which is the pulling back of your everyday consciousness and allowing a different consciousness to come up in moments of extreme stress or terror. And again, another purely biological function and something that can be avoided if we take care of ourselves and understand how it is that we function in times of stress. So take care of yourselves, do the self-soothing hugs, keep relating with people, feed yourself, rest yourself, understand your emotions, experience your emotions. Don't be afraid of your emotions. Don't be afraid of your nervous system. It's just you. There's nothing attacking you that's making you feeling that way. That's just you responding. All of this stuff is just you on the inside responding to stress. And when we can show compassion for ourselves and understand that, yeah, we're simply trying to survive, for as odd as it might seem for yourself or for other people, we're all just trying to survive. And that allows us to take this with a little bit softer approach, but also to regain our power and to regain our agency, or to keep what we have, and to use that to help first and foremost ourselves, and then everyone around us. And we will get through this. We do have still the opportunity to get through this. So, with that being said, be well, take care of yourself. May you have peace. May you have safety. Ooh, I dropped my mallet.